Today we're going to talk about the idea of biological homeostasis, or the ability to maintain a steady state within a cell, within a multicellular organism, or possibly even an environment. So there's going to be a need for certain sets of conditions to be maintained to ensure success, survival, or good health for an organism or possibly an environment. So even humans have certain characteristics that are found in narrow ranges, and they must continue to be found in those narrow ranges in order for us to survive, in order for us to have good health. Let's take a look at some of them. So we have things like body temp. We know that it has to sit in a very narrow range of temps in order for us to be healthy. Blood sugar must be maintained in a narrow range of values. Water balance must be correct. O2 and CO2 levels, or our respiratory gases, those must also be in the correct levels in order for us to be healthy. So as you look at or hear about a homeostatic scenario, what it's going to help to do as a biology student is be able to analyze that scenario. So you can analyze it by asking a few questions as you look at one. For example, you could ask, what is variable or changing moment to moment? Now, the whole time I've been talking, you've seen this character in the background walking on a tightrope. So let's use him as an example. As he walks down the tightrope, what is variable or changing moment to moment? Well, most of the time he seems to be pretty balanced, but every few seconds you'll notice there's a little bit of a jitter where he might be off balance for a second or two. So what would cause that to happen? Well, maybe he gets out of the center of the rope and he drifts to one side or the other. So his position over the tightrope is changing from moment to moment. The second question you could ask is, what should be the set point? Now, if I'm walking on a wire many feet from the ground, I'm hoping that I'm going to be centered over in this case, the tightrope. Now, any deviation from that center position is going to be called a stimulus. And if we look at those examples from down below, temperature, blood sugar, water balance, O2 and CO2 levels, they also have their own set points, their own center over a tightrope, but they're usually numerical values. So let's take a look at temperature, for example. Here you can see a lot of stuff going on, but what I want to show you is the center white column here. This is considered a normal set of values here for body temp. Now you'll notice that you see 36 and 38 here, kind of bookending that column, but of course that's in Celsius. Now if we were looking at that in Fahrenheit, we would have probably something like this, 97 here and 99 there, if you do the conversion. So that's what we consider normal body temp for optimum health. Now, what can happen day to day is we can venture into this territory depending on what we're doing. If we would get cold, we'd go into this shaded column, and if we get a little bit warm, we're going to wind up in this column. And that's okay because our body has mechanisms to bring it back to the white column, which is our steady state. Now, certain things can happen though where it can go even higher or lower than these two columns and in this darker section here. And this is when we get into a little bit of trouble. So we're not in the optimal range. In fact, we're nowhere near it if we're above 40 degrees Celsius or below 34 degrees Celsius. We actually consider them hyperthermia versus hypothermia. And when you enter these categories, you then start to see the effects on health tend to decline very quickly. So you'll notice that some of the things here that you see, for example, errors in judgment, cognitive function down, fever from exercise, cessation of sweating. If you got really hot and things started happening over here in this column, you'd be in big trouble health-wise. Similarly, over here on the left, in this hypothermic region, you're going to notice some things going on with heartbeat here. First, your heart beats fast as you get really cold, and then it starts slowing down again. When you stop shivering, that would be another example of something really bad that's happening, because the further you go to the right or to the left, you can actually start to approach death. So what we see though is as long as we tend to stay in this region here, there's mechanisms in play that will allow us to drift back from these regions here into the center and reach this optimal level right in the center here for body temp. We could also take a look at the same thing with blood sugar. If we look at normal blood sugar numbers, you'll notice that on the two ends we have 70 milligrams per deciliter, and that would be the low end, and we have 150 milligrams per deciliter on the high end. So from 70 to 150 is okay, but once you reach further down into this level here, you drop under 70 or you go over 150, all of a sudden you're now in the danger territory. So you're hoping you have a mechanism in play, a homeostatic mechanism that will bring you back to the good range. But if you don't, over here on this side, you wind up being hypoglycemic. And if you wind up on this side here, you'd be hyperglycemic. So both of those are not good conditions to be in, but we're lucky that we have mechanisms to bring us back into the good range. If those levels stay above and below for too long, that is what we call diabetes, and then we have to look further at what we can do to remedy that problem and get us back into the good range for blood sugar. Now, the water balance, the respiratory gases of O2 and CO2, they have similar mechanisms and similar outcomes if they go out of that optimal range. So the set point is going to be the set of values that allows that organism to maintain the best health possible. And when you drift outside of that normal range, outside of that set point, you hopefully have mechanisms to bring you back there, homeostatic mechanisms. All right, on to the third question. What are the sensors involved? And we'll go back to our example of our guy here on the tightrope. So how would you sense if you are reaching your set point, or at least if you are at your set point if you're walking on a tightrope? Well, the first thing, visually, of course, you could see if you were centered over the tightrope or not. And you'd have to make that decision very, very quickly. But there's a couple of other body parts that actually factor into balance as well. One of them, surprisingly, is in the muscles themselves. There's tiny little organs inside your muscles that sense when something is stretched too far, and what they do is they respond to that, and it might be a moment when you're falling or completely out of balance. Your muscles can respond in a certain way to keep you safer. The other place that we find a balancing awareness location is in our inner ears. When we study the human body later, you're going to learn how through our human ear we can actually detect balance or not in conjunction with working with a certain part of our brain. The fourth question is going to be, what is the integrator? What will make sense of the information? So where do the messages go to then decide what to do? And if you're thinking the brain, you're right on target. That is absolutely correct. The last question you want to ask when you're analyzing a homeostatic scenario are, what are the effectors? An effector is going to prompt responses. So if you're off kilter on top of your tightrope, what's going to bring you back? And a tightrope walker, the answer is going to be his muscles. However, when you're talking about temp, blood sugar, water balance, and respiratory gases, you're going to see different things, different effectors come into play as they try to right the imbalance that's going on. I chose to use an aquarium for this slide because an aquarium is a great example of how certain conditions must be met to ensure good health and survival of the things being kept inside that aquarium. So with that, we could drop the official definition of homeostasis: maintenance of a constant environment in response to internal or external conditions that change. So regardless of what's going on outside the aquarium, we got to keep what's inside the aquarium at certain conditions. And if certain things happen within that aquarium, we have to make sure that those things that do happen are going to benefit the organisms that live inside. So how do we do that? How do we maintain a constant environment? Well, if we're talking about an aquarium here, we can utilize these things down in the bottom left here. For example, the tank, the water, the air pump, filter, heater, and feeder. All of those things are going to lead to healthier critters that are kept on the inside and longer life and possibly ensuring their survival. For example, the tank itself. The tank itself has to hold in the water that's going to keep these aquatic creatures properly hydrated and being able to survive in that environment. The water itself must be at a certain level, and it must have a number of certain characteristics in order for those things to be alive. These are all freshwater fish. I can't go ahead and dump a whole bunch of salt in there and make it a saltwater tank. The air pump. Air pump is going to be required for the aquatic animals that require oxygen. If you're keeping an aquarium, probably everything in there will require oxygen. If you keep a goldfish in a bowl, the chances are that goldfish is not going to live too long because it's going to use up all the available oxygen. The water is going to get warm and the fish will basically slowly suffocate. So you want to make sure that you have a constant air source for organisms that require oxygen. Filter. Filter is required to clean up the water because animals are going to produce waste in that water. You don't want them to poison themselves. So the ability to take out that waste and keep the water clean is important. A heater. Just like in the last slide, we learned that temperature matters. And if we throw a bunch of tropical freshwater fish in water that's 50 degrees cold, they're probably not going to do too well because that's out of their optimal range. It's out of their set point. And lastly, of course, aquatic organisms require food. So the food must be there in ample quantities in order for survival to be ensured. Now, what we could do then is we could relate an aquarium and the homeostasis that it requires, that us humans, we often provide for it. Let's relate that to the human body. And some of the things that we do with an aquarium, we have to do ourselves because an aquarium is just basically, an analogy for a human body and the things that we need to survive as well. For example, the tank. Well, we kind of have a tank too. Our skin is our biggest organ we have, and it keeps a lot of fluids in. So do our cell membranes. So do the cavity walls where we find fluids on in our internal spaces. Our water. What are the liquids in a human being? Well, we have blood running through a system of vessels. We have intracellular fluid, all the fluid inside of all of our cells. We have something called extracellular fluid, which is the fluid in which cells bathe. We have cavities inside the body that just house certain types of fluid, and they all have to be in the right quantity and the right volume in order for us to stay healthy as well. Filter. Oh, actually, I missed air pump. If the water needs a certain O2 requirement, so do we. We have to have a certain amount of oxygen loaded up on our red blood cells in order to serve all the cells of our body. So it's a highly demanding task. We also have to be able to have a system in play that rids us of CO2, our waste product, so we don't poison ourselves with waste as well. Filter. We have to keep our body clean, just like the water must be clean in an aquarium. We have a couple organs that help us out with that. Our liver and our kidneys are going to help keep things in the right concentrations and protect us from things that might hurt us. A heater is required in an aquarium, just like with us, if we get too cold or too hot, we have to have mechanisms in play that will bring us back to that set point. And those are typically found in a little structure in our brain called the hypothalamus, our internal thermostat. And lastly, feeder. We have to have a way to get nutrients inside of us so we can nourish the cells that need it, and we do that through our digestive system. So we can really relate the human body and its needs to what an aquarium needs very easily. Okay, I have a simple example of a homeostatic scenario that I'd like you to analyze. So what I would like you to do is go ahead and scan the pictures that you see here on this slide. And then what I'd like you to do is try to pop in some of the terminology that you picked up in the first slide. See if you can fill in the blanks as you go, and I'll kind of walk you through it. So in the top picture at the 12 o'clock position, we see a house, and we see that the temperature is decreasing outside, which means the temperature is going to decrease within the house as well. So for a given variable, fluctuations above or below a certain, so we have a certain temperature in the house, and that is going to be if you're thinking set point, you got it right. All right, now, if we drop below that set point, we said that a particular term will apply here, and that's what we call a stimulus. So the stimulus here is the temp going down within the house. Because there is a thermometer connected to the thermostat, and it's going to be constantly measuring the temperature, that is going to be our sensor. So the thermometer portion of the thermostat is the sensor, and it's going to go ahead and send information via wires to the other part of your thermostat, which is now going to be acting as your integrator, because it's going to make sense of the fact the temp has now dropped, and it's going to send a correction signal via electrical wires to, the furnace, and the furnace is going to kick on. Now, what we could say in terms of, our biological vocab here, it's going to trigger a response by, our furnace is going to be our effector. So the effector then is going to turn on, it's going to generate heat in the house, get it back up to that set point level, maybe even a little bit past it. As soon as it hits that level, there should be a mechanism that shuts off the furnace, and now you're back to your set point level, and now your homeostatic loop has been completed, and you're back to normal again. Let's try to relate this picture here to the scenario with the house. Here we have a hiker who planned incorrectly for the weather that she'd be hiking in. And you can tell that by her dress. And you see that it's snowing outside and she's caught in shorts and a short sleeve shirt. So what's happening to her is she is now being faced with an environment that's turning very cold, which her body is going to have to detect through her sensor, which is going to be her skin. There's little temp receptors under the surface of your skin, and they send messages by way of the nervous system to our integrator. So just like the thermostat on the house, we have one in our head, and it's called the hypothalamus, and it's down here. So the hypothalamus is going to be our integrator. It's going to make sense of what's happening with the temperature and the fact that our body temp is going down. And it's going to send a correction signal, again, via the nervous system to the things that are going to warm us back up. And those are your muscles. So there's going to be signals being sent to your muscles to go ahead and start shivering. And the shivering that you do generates warmth. And possibly, if you shiver enough, you're going to get warm enough to hopefully get back to a warm environment so you're not in that cold environment for too long. Otherwise, we saw some of the effects that could happen if you go hypothermic for too long. So the shivering will then bring us back to our set point, which is normal body temp, and hopefully she can escape this precarious situation. Let's take a look at the opposite scenario for a second. So in this picture, we'll imagine that's you up there and you just decided you were going to go do some exercise on a 90-degree day. So you're sweating and you're overheated and you need to cool off. Well, let's take a look at our little table here that has a whole bunch of blanks, so I'll let you fill them in as we go. So our set point, our normal body temp, again, is 36 to 38 degrees Celsius, or we could say it's 97 to 99 Fahrenheit. So what's going to happen here? Well, first thing is we have our set point and we have now gone up. So because the set point has changed, our body needs to respond to that. That's the kind of the stimulus aspect. And what's going to happen, again, the hot and cold receptors are going to fire under the skin's surface. It's going to send a message to our integrator, which is our brain. Of course, it's that hypothalamus again, which is in the center of our brain. And the hypothalamus will then send messages via neural wiring to certain body parts that are going to help us cool back down. So one of those things is going to be your sweat glands. Your sweat glands are going to start to produce sweat, because when it does, the evaporation of that sweat off your skin has a cooling effect on the body. That's one of the mechanisms that's going to bring you back down into a safe range near the set point. The other thing that's going to happen is your blood vessels in your skin are going to dilate, which means they're going to go from small to larger, which means you're going to be able to bring blood closer to the surface, where heat can then radiate from the surface of your skin outside to the environment, enhancing the cooling effect of the sweat that's already happening right now. So those two things in conjunction with each other hopefully will bring your temperature back down. Your body temp decreases, your thermostat, your hypothalamus will shut off the cooling mechanisms at that point. So I'm sure you've noticed in the past couple of slides that loops seem to dominate as we talk about homeostasis. And in fact, we do call them feedback loops. And what you've seen so far is going to qualify as what we say a negative feedback loop. And if you look after the comma, it says which helps to return a variable to either a normal range or a set point. So all of those changes that we saw winding up back at the set point again, once again being normal. And again, a variable could change that in the future, but for now it's back to the set point. Now, most homeostatic control systems will function by this mechanism, a negative feedback loop. where the return to the steady state or buildup of end product shuts the system off. We haven't seen that yet, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So we can also see a buildup of an end product shutting a system off or down. Okay, but before I revisit that, I do want to talk about the other type of feedback, which is called positive feedback. Positive feedback loops, they're going to occur in animals, but usually don't contribute to homeostasis. In fact, they kind of do the opposite. So what they do, if something goes out of balance, it will then get amplified and go further out of balance than it was before. So instead of writing something that's now out of balance, it's now sending even further in the wrong direction. And it will do that until a particular process is over. We'll see some examples of that in just a little bit. So basically what we're talking about here with homeostasis is we're centered around the idea of balance. And we said earlier in this second bullet here, buildup of end products. And what I'm alluding to here is that there's a lot of chemical stuff going on within living organisms. And one of the things that we can talk about is that those chemical processes that are occurring, they're also functioning in a homeostatic way. They're bringing things back into normal ranges when they're outside of that normal range. And we have a word for that, and that word is metabolism. So metabolism is officially defined as the sum total of all physical and chemical reactions occurring within the living body. These keep a steady state within an organism. So we're going to see some examples in just a little bit of how that functions, how chemical changes can work in essence to bring things back into a normal balance. Our next stop is taking a look at some of the chemical things that go on inside the body that relate to homeostasis. A lot of times, the body will require certain amounts of substances to be created, and then once that amount has been created, there needs to be a mechanism to shut it off again. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the examples over here on the right, and in the first example, what we see here is we see a chain of different chemicals, A, B, C, and D. We're going to imagine that our body needs substance D, but to get to substance D, we initially have to ingest nutrient A. And you have to go through a number of chemical changes to eventually get D, because that's what our body needs right now. So we'll say we ingest some A, and over here on the right, to convert to the other chemicals, we're going to need little chemical helpers, little protein helpers called enzymes. So enzyme 1 is going to change nutrient A into chemical B. Enzyme 2 is going to change chemical B to chemical C. Enzyme 3 is going to change chemical C to chemical D, the one we need. And it's going to produce a lot of it as long as we have a lot of nutrient A going into this chain. So we have a whole bunch of excess D, and our body will eventually reach the limit that it needs, and it will say, okay, you can shut that off now. And you can see this red arrow here. By producing an excess of D, D has an effect of interacting with enzyme number 1, and it's going to shut it down. So if there's no enzyme 1 working, A will no longer be converted to B, no longer be converted to C, and you'll no longer get product D, the thing that we needed originally. So this chain here has a way of shutting itself off, and that is what we call a negative feedback loop. So if we were to look at it on a graph, once we have enough of it, it's going to do whatever it needs to do to shut that particular loop back off. Now let's contrast that with a positive feedback loop like we see on the bottom. So down there, we see that, again, we have a scenario where we'll imagine that we need product Z. And to get to Z, we have to start with nutrient W. So again, we have 3 enzymes, enzyme 4, 5, and 6, and they're all going to work to convert each chemical into something else to eventually give us the Z that we need. So enzyme 4 changes W to X, enzyme 5 changes X to Y, and enzyme 6 changes Y to Z. Z, an accumulation of Z, instead of shutting off an enzyme, for some reason it's going to ramp up production. So it's going to make this enzyme work even harder to produce more Z. So it's going to be an endless cycle. The more Z that's produced, the more enzymes that get turned on and get stimulated by that compound to produce even more Y and Z. So that positive feedback loop will continue to go up and go up until some process is over. I quickly want to throw a positive feedback loop example at you so you have an understanding of what's happening here, of something that's out of balance, going further out of balance, and never spiraling back to the set point. Instead, it continues and continues until a particular process is over. For example, this is a positive feedback loop showing the theory of climate change. And climate change is going to center around the fact that Earth is warming. So what we see in the direct center is the fact that temperatures are warming up. Now, of course, we're talking about global averages, but the temp doesn't increase everywhere in the same way. In fact, the polar regions warm quite a bit faster than all the other regions on the planet. And in doing so, there's dire consequences. For example, we know that the polar ice caps are white. They're white with ice and snow, and that tends to reflect solar radiation back into space. But what happens when the polar regions warm up and that ice and that white snow melts? Well, what's beneath? In both cases, you have water at the North Pole and you have land at the South Pole. And if those white layers suddenly melt, you now have dark layers underneath it. So the sea ice cover is going to melt, it's going to get smaller, and in doing so, it's going to allow darker colors to then start absorbing more sunlight. So after that occurs, what we see happening is that we now have more black and dark colors exposed, and the oceans are going to start absorbing more of that heat, which of course, if it's touching more ice and snow, is going to allow that to melt as well, which is then going to cause temperatures to warm up even more, which will then trigger more ice melting and more snow melting. And it's an endless cycle getting worse and worse and worse. So if things continue as the way they're going now, we can see big trouble in the future because this will continue until the process is over. So that's the idea of positive feedback, that as something gets out of its natural balance, it will continue going further and further from that set point until that process is over. Okay, this slide here is where you test yourself. So my students, what I want you to do at this point is I want you to go through these 6 examples. I want you to analyze them. And I want you to determine if you feel like it's an example of negative feedback or positive feedback. And then we'll go over the answers in class. Okay, let's go ahead and summarize what we've learned today. So homeostasis is the ability for an organism to maintain a steady state within itself. That steady state must have a certain set point of values, and any balance that goes outside of that set of values, hopefully there's a mechanism in play that will bring it back into that area. Let's look at this picture here just for a second. We have sodium balance here on the left, water balance here on the right. And both of these are very much intertwined with each other. And there's a couple of conditions here, I'll put them in red, that are bad: hypertonicity and hypotonicity. Instead, what we want is we want to be right here at the set point level. Now, we're not going to get into this diagram today, but it is on our list, and we get into the human body. We're going to talk about how we maintain the right amount of tonicity within a living thing as well. We'll look at humans and we'll look at other organisms and how they do it. So overall here, we're trying to maintain that steady state balance within a cell, within an organism, or possibly in an environment. That's one other example we could throw in here real quick. If a certain habitat, a certain environment is missing, let's say its apex predator, then anything below it on the food chain is suddenly going to increase in number. And what if they increase too fast? What it might mean is that there will now be competition for the available resources that are there. Originally, the apex predator kept those numbers just right, and it was a well-balanced ecosystem or habitat. But without a certain species present in that food chain, everything is now out of balance, and the system will now compensate and find a new normal. So things will change over time, but it's bad for the current health of that ecosystem. Just like any change from the set point within an organism is going to be bad for that organism and could possibly lead to the loss of that organism as well. So I hope you understand homeostasis a little bit better now. Plenty of more to come. I'll talk to you next time. See ya.